All right, good evening. My name is Gina Warner. I'm a managing broker with Red One Realty. I'm here this evening to hopefully finish up the Columbus Board of Realtors contract training. This is our fifth installment, and the other four can be found on the AMP YouTube page. So if you're not subscribed there, you should get subscribed. Go there and check out the four previous installments. It's taken us a lot longer to get through this than I was anticipating, but I really hope and believe that we can finish it up tonight. And I also did make sure we're not going to get cut off at exactly the 59-minute mark. So hopefully that doesn't happen again. 'Cause I was telling a story last week and we got cut off. It was so annoying. And now I don't remember the story, or otherwise I'd just go back and tell you, but we're going to start in section 10.1, and I have it up here on the screen. Of course, last week we talked about title insurance, and that was a big discussion topic, to always make sure that your buyer gets title insurance, because there can just be all kinds of things that come up. And that's what my story was about, but I won't go into it right now for the sake of time. But there can be all kinds of things that come up on the property that could cause a title issue. And if your buyer doesn't have title insurance, they may regret it down the road somewhere. So section 10, we're talking about utility charges, condo charges, interest, rentals, security deposits. So on most residential transactions, this will not actually apply. Other than the utility charges. So 10.1 is about utility charges. Through the date of possession, the seller agrees to pay all accrued utilities and other charges that may become a lien on the premises. So I think that's pretty much common sense, that the seller continues to pay for their utilities until the buyer takes possession of the property. As far as how that happens, it's just a communication item between you and the other agent. You can just let them know, okay, we're moving out this day, so buyer, go ahead and get the utilities transferred. Most utility companies will work with you as far as, if you don't call in and say you're going to cancel on exactly the same day the buyer says they're going to start, they'll usually carry it over a day or two, just so that utilities do not get turned off. One thing that you want to make sure of, if possible, is that the utilities do not get turned off in between the seller and the buyer. In the winter, this could be an issue if the pipes freeze and the water lines break, and you could cause damage to the house. In the summer, probably not as much concern about that, but usually there's a restart fee that the buyer would have to pay if the utilities get turned off in between. So just do your best to communicate with the other agent and make sure that all gets transferred to everybody's best benefit. And then it says adjustments will be made through the date of closing for rentals, interest on mortgage assumed by the buyer, condominium or other association periodic charges. So this is kind of like a proration, just like the tax proration. They just look at the date of closing. So the rentals would have to do with being a rental property. It could also have to do with renting something that's in the property. If the buyer's taken over, say, renting a water heater, something like that. Interest on a mortgage assumed by the buyer. So that would be in the case that the buyer comes in, does a loan assumption on a portion of the mortgage. So the interest would be accrued to the date of closing, and then it would be transferred for the responsibility to the other party. And then the condo or other association periodic charges. So if they have a monthly fee, for example, and you close on the 15th, the seller would pay half the month, the buyer would pick up the other half the month. And the title company takes care of all those things. You just might need to let them know, hey, there's a condo fee, or hey, there's a rental on a water heater. They're not going to know that stuff unless you tell them. But once you tell them that it needs to be prorated, they'll take care of that for you. 10.3 is about security deposits that would be transferred to the buyer. And this has to do with if the property is a rental property. So seller A has a property that they've owned for 5 years. They have a $1,000 security deposit on hold for when the renter started taking that. The renters have been there a long time. Buyer takes over. that security deposit would transfer to the new buyer so that when the renter moves out, if everything is satisfactory, the renters would get the security deposit back. And then at closings for condo properties or properties subject to an HOA, the buyer will pay initial reserves and capital contributions. So these are fees that are charged by homeowners association and condos. And this specifies who's going to pay what. So the buyer pays initial reserves and capital contributions, civic associations and anything to do with the transfer, and any fee associated with lender required documents, which can be a lot. And then the seller will pay all the other fees that are charged in connection with the sale or transfer of the premises, including the transfer, processing, expediting, delivery, statement, or management company fees. So the fees that mostly are charged by HOA are kind of split up between the buyer and the seller. But I would say that most of the time the seller pays the lion's share of those. Sheila says, can you explain the initial reserves? Not very well. I'll just tell you that. From what I know about initial reserves, that would be an amount of money that the homeowners association or the condo association would collect from the owners in order to have money in reserve for something that they need to take care of down the road. So maybe it's a sidewalk. A sidewalk that they know is going to need to be replaced in 2 years, and they're going through and collecting money from everyone in the community. That could be considered an initial reserve. So your buyer might have to put that money into the HOA into their holding fund, so that when those sidewalks need replaced, their portion of it has already been paid. That's just an example, kind of a rough one, but that's all I got for you on initial reserves. Does anybody else have any comments on what initial reserves might mean? Malika, any ideas on this?
I am not sure. Sorry about that.
I think it's a pretty reasonable, common sense explanation. Yeah, that's all I got for you on that. Okay, section 11. Any other questions on section 10? Like I said, it's pretty much common sense. Seller pays for stuff until they move out, and then buyer starts paying. Pretty much straightforward. Okay. Next section is damage or destruction of premises. So, note, it is strongly recommended that upon discovery of damage or destruction, the parties retain legal counsel. The reason for that being that once you walk over into the damage or destruction of premises, you're really outside of the expertise of most real estate, really any real estate agent, because they start negotiating damages and things like that. And it can really it can become a legal matter and not something that you as the real estate agent should get involved in because of the practice of law that you're not allowed to do. Just in case your buyers ever wonder, the risk of loss to the premises and appurtenances, so everything attached, occurring prior to closing shall be borne by the seller. So it's not, the buyer doesn't have to buy it if a tree falls through it and the night before closing, if a wire line breaks and causes $40,000 worth of damage to the kitchen, and both of those happened in my deals in previous times, the buyer is no longer required to purchase the home. This is how they get out. So section 11.2, if any part of the premises covered by the contract shall be substantially damaged or destroyed from the date of written acceptance through the date and time of closing, the seller will give a written notice to the buyer and the buyer's broker the damage or destruction has occurred. Such notice must include all pertinent information regarding insurance policies and claims covering the premises, including the amount of any applicable policy deduction. The written notice will be delivered within 2 calendar days from the date of the discovery of the damage or destruction. And this is what can happen upon notice. So actually I had something like this happen where my sellers were moving to Wisconsin, and the day they were moving out, which was on a Sunday, and closing was on Monday, they had pre-signed. So the buyer was going to sign on Monday. And the day they were moving out, they ran into the corner of the house with the moving truck and completely destroyed the front porch. And we weren't sure what else, but it was a bad deal. And basically what happened was they ran into the house, finished loading the truck, and drove away. And they called me from somewhere in northern Ohio and said, hey, we have a little problem. We just left and we ran into the corner of the house with the truck. And so it was on me then to figure out what in the world to do. And basically, we came down to the options that are here. So you could agree to extend the closing date, or to the extent reasonably necessary to allow the seller to fix the premises, or accept the premises in its damaged condition with an assignment of insurance proceeds, if any are available, or terminate the contract by giving written notice to the seller and seller's broker. Upon termination, the earnest money deposit and any non-refundable deposits shall be returned to the buyer pursuant to paragraph 12. And then if the failure by the buyer to notify the seller or seller's broker within 10 days from the receipt of the notice of damage that they're going to proceed shall constitute an election by the buyer to terminate. So you'd have to make sure that you communicate if anything like this ever happens. Failure by the seller to provide the written notice shall result in the buyer, upon discovery of the damage or destruction, having all rights set forth in paragraph 11.2. So they have these choices again. And then 11.5, if buyer discovers the damage or destruction after closing, buyer will have the right to pursue all legal remedies. Now, this part here, right to pursue all legal remedies, is when they're going to need, more than likely, going to need an attorney. Now, could you, if you were the buyer's agent, call up the listing agent and say, hey, they discovered this after your people moved out and we've already moved in and we discovered this problem. Could you work it out between the two listing agents and the buyer and seller? You could. But also the buyer, you as the agent involved may just want to say, you know what, this is outside of my expertise and I can't really contribute to this conversation. I would say you might want to, if it's something small that can be fixed with maybe a few $100s and everybody walks away happy, then you're probably fine to deal with it. But if it gets any bigger than that, you really need to tell your client to contact an attorney. So, and obviously, if you look up here in 11.2, because Grant and I are dealing with something right now where he's got a buyer buying one of my bank-owned properties. And of course, the bank-owned property, the seller is in California or somewhere. They've never seen the property. They've gotten hundreds of pictures of the property from me, but I can't say that I ever took pictures of every inch of the siding in the house. And now the buyer is saying that there are more holes in the siding of the house than there were when he put it in contract. I have no way to prove whether there is or not. But I will tell you that the bank is going to consider that to be not substantially damaged, especially on this particular house where it needs a new septic system, it needs a new roof, and it's got a basement full of molds. That a couple $100s worth of siding, the seller is probably not going to do anything to respond to that situation. Plus, there's no way to prove that it's a new damage, caused by the current landscaping company or whatever that might be. So you can definitely get into some small tussles about this, but if you get into anything that can't be amicably settled fairly quickly, fairly inexpensively, easily, definitely tell your client to consult an attorney. Any questions on that? Comments? Hi, Mark.
Hello.
Last time Mark was here and he was hiding, so I want to make sure that everybody knows he's here now. So I got you, man. I caught you. Okay. Any questions? Any comments on that? I got a couple things in the chat here. Let's see. I love your story, says Sheila. What did you do in your situation with a moving truck? Oh, yes, I never finished that story. So what I did was the buyer's agent was awesome. He was someone I worked with before. And I called him up and I said, oh my gosh, Sean, this is what happened. And it just so happened that the buyer was his brother and sister-in-law. And so he called them up, told them what happened. And so this was a Sunday. I think I found out on Sunday morning, like 11 or 12 or something like that. So the other agent and I decided that what we would try to do is to get an estimate on the repairs from somebody that was acceptable to both the buyer and the seller, and have the title company escrow money escrow money for the repairs, and then go ahead and close the deal the next day. Well, it turned out to be very challenging because between the buyer's agent and myself, we called 16 different contractors that Sunday afternoon, and we could not get anybody to say they would come and help us. We needed someone to come and give an estimate. Then everybody be like, okay, that sounds good. That sounds good. Let's close this thing. And so we couldn't get anybody to come. And finally, I know a roofer here locally, and he's a good friend, but he's basically a commercial roofer. He does not do jobs this small. He doesn't. He does big stuff. And so, but I got a hold of him and I said, hey, would you by any chance please come and look at this for me? And he said he would. And he was over there within like an hour. He gave us a bid. It so happened that that contractor has such a good reputation in the community that the buyer's agent also knew him very well and knew his quality of work, trusted his decision-making on the situation. He gave us an estimate. We went ahead and withheld that money plus 50% more from the seller's proceeds. The title company held them. We did what's called an escrow agreement. The title company held that extra money. And then it took about 8 months. We finally got the house fixed. The actual structure of the house itself was not damaged except for a little bit on one corner above one of the gutters, and it was not something that was going to leak. But the porch had to be completely redone. And so we got the estimate from the local contractor. We escrowed money above and beyond what he said he was going to need. And then the next 8 months were spent basically fighting it out with the seller's insurance company. They did not want to pay. I think the bid was around $12,000 for this contractor to do the repairs, and they didn't want to pay $12,000. They sent an adjuster over there and said that it was only going to be like $2,000. And of course, the local contractor's like, oh my gosh, no way they could fix this for $2,000. And so then what they did was they went ahead and sent a contractor over there. But when the contractor got over there, he said, no way I can fix this for $2,000. It's going to be more like $11,000 or something commensurate with what the first contractor had said. So over the course of the 8 months of fighting with the insurance company, the porch just kind of hung there in its damaged state. But eventually it got fixed. And the buyer was very happy, and the seller had already set the money aside. The insurance company paid for it, so the seller got all but $1,000, I think, of his money back from the title company that he had set aside. So that's how we resolved that situation. It was really fun. But 8 months after my clients were in Wisconsin, I was still dealing with their house, and that's just the way it goes sometimes. All right. Earnest money deposit. So as we've had discussion of before, Red One greatly prefers that you have the title company hold the earnest money. And if you do have the title company hold the earnest money, you don't really need most of this section of the contract. So you can still go and say the buyer will make an earnest money deposit of $1,000 or whatever. But what you want to do is go to the very first page, and I did this with Alma the other night when I helped her write her offer. Go to the additional terms and conditions and type it in here. The earnest money shall be held by seller's title company or seller's choice of title company, I think is what we put. And then also put earnest money shall be deposited within 3 days of the end of the remedy period. Oh, Mark is clapping his hands. Thank you, Mark. Is that the way we like it?
Wait, that's the only way to go. 3 days after the remedy period.
Yes. 3 days after the remedy period. It saves you so much trouble If your buyer terminates during the inspection period or during the remedy period, you can't get figured out, then the seller still has to release the earnest money if it's already been deposited. So by doing it after the end of the remedy period, you eliminate 80 to 90% of those kind of issues. And so then when you're down here in this part, you can write $1,000 in there right here, but you don't need to have them initial this or this. Just leave those blank, because by them writing this in here and then signing the last page of the document, it's covered. Everybody knows what's going to happen with the earnest money. Okay, and then this just goes on to talk about it. Within 3 calendar days they receive the earnest money, the buyer's broker will notify that the buyer has made the earnest money deposit. So if your title company is holding your earnest money, then all you got to do is have the title company send a notification that they have received the earnest money. And usually that's just in the form of an email. And that should be satisfactory. Everybody saves that to their file and everybody knows who's got the earnest money. And then if the seller or seller's broker doesn't receive this deposit notice within 3 calendar days following this date, the seller could notify the buyer in writing that the seller has not received the deposit and demand the notice of deposit. Then if they receive the deposit within 3 days after the notice of demand, the parties will proceed. If the seller does not receive the deposit notice within 3 days after asking for the deposit demand, the buyer will be in breach of the contract and the seller can terminate by deliver written notification. So when you have earnest money on a deal, the important thing for you as the agent to remember is that you need to follow these timelines. When you put a property in contract, put it on your calendar. Make sure your client has it on their calendar. The earnest money is due by this date. Unless we terminate, the earnest money is due by July 14th. And make sure that you remind yourself a couple days ahead of July 14th. So if in case they forgot, you can remind them this has to be done. Because if you miss the earnest money deadline and then they demand it and you miss the demand deadline, your buyer is at risk of losing this contract. So we don't want that to happen. And then section 12.2 talks about when it's deposited in the broker's trust account. This little deposit receipt right here in the middle of the contract, it's kind of dumb. I mean, if you were going to use it, you could, but then you basically would just have to pull out this one page of the document and send it over, or copy it and sign it and send it over. It's kind of I don't really think there's any point in having this in here. Plus, there are other documents in .loop that are earnest money deposit receipt documents that you can use. That's going to be a whole lot easier than copying one page out of the middle of the contract. So I never use this little form here, but sometimes people still do. Okay, then the whole rest of section 12 is all about what happens with the earnest money in various situations. And you really need to take your time and study through this. And we're already 30 minutes into our time frame, and we could spend the next 30 minutes on this. But basically, you need to take a look at this, make sure you understand it, who gets the earnest money when, and if you don't understand it, ask somebody. So I'll read through it quickly, though. If any written contingency is not satisfied or waived, so that would be the appraisal contingency, the inspection contingency, the financing contingency, all those are written contingencies. If they're not either satisfied or waived, in other words, they say, okay, the inspection is good, or you're going to waive your inspection. That's it. Satisfy it or waive it. Or if the seller fails or refuses to perform, or the buyer terminates pursuant to any of the applicable provisions, all the earnest money will go back to the buyer. So when a buyer signs a contract, they have multiple ways to get out of it and still get their earnest money back. They have the inspection contingency, they have the remedy period, they have the financing contingency, they have the appraisal contingency, they even have the title contingency if the title comes back and there's something wrong in the title. So there's multiple ways that a buyer can get their earnest money back by these applicable provisions that are talked about right here. Those are all what I just mentioned. And the buyer will get the earnest money back. But if the buyer fails or refuses to perform, the earnest money deposited shall be paid to the seller. So in other words, if the inspection is good or the remedies get worked out and the financing is fine and the appraisal is fine and the title work is fine and everything is good, but the buyer just flat out refuses to complete the transaction, then their earnest money is at risk. And then it's supposed to be paid to the seller. Now, it could become a fight, but we'll talk about if it comes to fight, what happens to that later. In any event, except as provided in paragraph 3.3 and subject to collection by the buyer's broker depositor, all earnest money is to be dispersed as follow. If the transaction closes, the broker disperses the earnest money deposited hereunder to the buyer, or so they give it back to the buyer, or they give it to the closing or escrow agent, so the title company, to be applied to the purchase price, or the brokerage can actually retain the earnest money and credit towards commission owed to the brokerage. So this is if everything goes fine and the transaction closes. These are the three options for what can happen in the earnest money. So you could actually, so if Red One was holding the earnest money, Red One could actually write a check right back to the buyer. So Joe Smith, here's a check. This is the earnest money you gave us to hold, and we're giving it right back to you. Or it can be written out to Vault Title and become part of the closing funds for the buyer on the transaction. Or the brokerage can actually keep the earnest money and credit it toward their commission. So if the earnest money is $1,000 and you're the agent, the buyer's agent, and you're going to get $5,000, then you would only get $4,000 straight from the commission, and $1,000 would come from the earnest money. Now, I will tell you that this number 3 here, not the first choice. This is not the first choice, but because of running a brokerage myself for 10 years, I know this is a bookkeeping nightmare. I mean, I'm sure Red One has a way to do it, and I'm sure they've got it down. And I've had to do it a few times with Red One, or agents that I was supervising had to do it because you forgot to get the check or something like that. But I'll tell you, it is not nearly as much fun or easy than if you just go ahead and give it to the title company. And so giving the earnest money to the title company in the first place eliminates all this choice here. The title company's got the money. It's going to be applied to the purchase price. End of story. Just makes it so much easier. Now, let's see. So that was section A. The transaction closes. This is what happens. Section B, the parties provide the broker with written instructions that both parties have signed that specify how the broker is to disperse the earnest money deposited hereunder. The broker acts pursuant to those instructions. Okay, so this would be a document such as a mutual release. So if the earnest money's already been deposited, it terminates for some reason, say it's an appraisal contingency that couldn't be satisfied, and the contract is terminated, then a mutual release would be signed. If you haven't seen a mutual release, go into .loop and look for it. It's basically a document that says this contract is terminated. The earnest money currently being held by blank is to hereby be distributed to blank. And then both buyer and seller sign that document. And so that is a written instruction that specify how the earnest money is to be dispersed. Okay. The broker receives a copy of a court order that specifies to whom all earnest money deposited is to be awarded, and the broker acts according to the court order. This would be in the case where an earnest money was being disputed. So the buyer thinks they should get the earnest money back. Seller thinks they should get to keep the earnest money. There's a fight about it. There might have to be a court order. So you're talking about attorneys being involved and a court order written saying this is who a judge says the earnest money should go to. That will be a big mess if that happens. The earnest money could become unclaimed funds, and that talks about what happens to that. And then in section E, in the event of a dispute between a seller and buyer regarding the disbursement of any earnest money, the broker is required by Ohio law to maintain these funds in his trust account until one of the following things happens. 1, written instruction specifying how it's to be dispersed, which is exactly what section B up here says as well. So they're reiterating it. A final court order that specifies who the earnest money is to go to, which is the same as this right here. And then if neither of those happen within 2 years from the date the earnest money was deposited, the parties have not provided the broker with instructions or a court order, the broker will then give the money back to the buyer, and the seller does not have to be notified. So if your seller ever thinks they've got a lot of leverage because they've got $1,000 earnest money, they really don't. Because if the buyer doesn't agree that the seller should keep the earnest money and nobody wants to take it to court, the money's going to be held by the broker for 2 years and it's going to be given back to the buyer anyway. So I always tell buyers there are a lot of ways you can get your earnest money back and very few ways that the seller ever gets to keep it. So the earnest money is just kind of a good faith move, but the value of the earnest money as far as being something that could really help a seller offset problems, or, you know, it's just really not there. It's kind of a weak thing. It's nice to say, oh, they're very serious. They want to put $1,000 earnest money. Yeah, but there's very few ways that they're not going to get that money back. Okay. Any questions on this so far? It's complicated. Read over it so that you can explain it to your clients. All right. 12.4, except as provided in paragraph 3.3, the return or payment of the earnest money shall in no way prejudice the rights of the seller, buyer, or broker in any action for damages or specific performances. So just because the earnest money was given back to the buyer, for example, doesn't mean the seller couldn't still sue the buyer if the buyer terminated for a reason that the seller did not feel was justified, or vice versa. If the seller terminated, then the buyer could go after them for, failure to complete the contract. All right. Anything else on that earnest money stuff? Okay. Section 13.1. Okay, all of section 13 is just kind of random stuff. So you can read over this in detail, but basically 13.1 says that this contract is the entire agreement. There's no other contract, there's no other agreements outside of this contract or any addendum or amendment to the contract. So basically, this is the only document that is putting forth the terms of the agreement. Section 13.2 is the time is of the essence. So in other words, don't mess around. If you got a buyer who's dragging their feet, if you got a seller who was like delaying on fixing things, it's your job as the agent to poke them a little bit and say, hey, time is of the essence. We've got a deadline here. We have to get this done. We have to meet our contract requirements. We have to get this thing through. So time is of the essence in all the provisions of the contract. 13.3, everything in here, so the representations, the covenants, the warranties of the parties contained in the contract shall survive the closing. So I'm not an attorney and I don't play one on TV, but what I think this means is that if you represent that there were no gas leases, if you're a seller and you're representing and there were no gas leases on the property, and you had to certify that up here in another section that we've already talked about, and then you come to find out afterwards that there was a gas lease, you can't say, oh, well, too late, we're closed, you're stuck. No, you represented something in that contract and it survives the closing. The things that you said survives the closing. In fact, I learned recently that in Ohio, the statute of limitations on contract law is actually 6 years. So you know how the Division of Real Estate tells you should keep all your documents for 3 years? You actually should probably keep them for 6 years, because that is the amount of time that someone could actually come back and sue you for something that happened in a contract that you represented something that didn't turn out to be true or whatever. Now, does it happen very often? Probably not. But it could. And the other thing that you need to know is that the statute of limitations in Ohio for fraud is 4 years. And that's longer than the 3 years they say you should keep your documents as well. So in other words, if you as an agent represented something, or you told somebody something, and it turned out that you presented fraudulent information, they could still come after you 4 years after that representation took place. So, yeah, keep that in mind. Keep all your stuff. Okay, section 13.4, definitions. Okay, so these are just what broker means, what a day is, just some basic stuff there. 13.5 is signatures. So it's saying that manual or electronic signatures can be utilized in this contract. 13.6, the date of acceptance of this contract, counteroffers, amendments, or modification shall be when the final writing signed by the parties is delivered to the offering party. So this is an important thing to recognize, because people are often, we sent the offer on July 1st, but they didn't sign it till July 3rd, and I didn't get it till July 5th because it was a holiday. So when is the date of acceptance? So technically, if that was the case, July 5th would be the date of acceptance. You would always want to, if there's ever a discrepancy on this, you want to jump on it right away at the beginning of the contract period. Don't wait until you're 7 days in and your home inspector is delayed and you're at the 7th day of your inspection period and you're like, wait a minute, didn't they send that back to us a couple days late? Let me go look. Well, if you go back then, it's just going to look like you're a whiner and you're making excuses. Okay, so if you do not receive the contract on the same day that the last party signed the contract, you need to touch base with that agent and get something in writing that says, hey, you guys signed it last Friday, but I didn't get it till today. And so I can't start, my buyer can't start their inspection period until we get the signed contract. So certainly we can't count that weekend, right? And you just kind of come to an agreement with them that this is what's happening. Mark, do you have something to add?
Yes, that's why you do the timetable as soon as you get the contract back.
Mm-hmm.
So, and then you share it with the other agent and whoever else. And that way they're on notice as to when it starts and when everything is due, the deadlines.
Yep, very good. Yes, provide that. And then if there is something, make sure you bring it up with them. Sometimes you can just send stuff over, they don't really read it, and then you don't know whether or not they agree with it. So if you think there's going to be a discrepancy, make sure to talk about it, get them to respond to you via email or text that they agree, oh yeah, we delayed 2 days, so your inspection period won't actually end until blank. So, and then the note there in bold, strongly recommended that the delivering party notify delivery has been received by the other party. So if it's an offer, if it's a signed contract, if it's a signed counter, I always just like to respond, hey, thank you very much. I got it, talk to you later, or looking forward to working with you, or whatever. Just something to indicate, yes, I've got this and we're starting now. Okay. Any other questions about that? Let me check the chat box. Nope. Okay. So section 13.7 is the Foreign Investments in Real Property Tax Act, the FIRPTA. How many of you guys have heard about the FIRPTA? You're like, what in the world is a FIRPTA? So it's a really, really strange term in the contract that you may never run across, but you might. So you need to be aware of it. So if the seller is a foreign person as defined by the Foreign Investments in Real Property Tax Act, which you can look that up, but basically it's someone who's not a U.S. citizen, or I think there's certain statuses of green cards and visas that might also be incorporated in that. But if the seller is not it is a foreign person as defined by this act. Section 1445 of the IRS code requires the buyer to withhold 15% of the amount realized by the seller, so that's the seller's proceeds, on the transfer, and remit the withheld amount to the Internal Revenue Service, unless there's an exemption or a reduced rate of withholding. If the withholding is required, Treasury regulations require sellers and buyers to provide their U.S. federal tax ID on all filings. Seller and buyer agree to execute and deliver any document reasonably necessary to comply with FIRPTA requirements. So you're like, wait a minute, what did that say? So basically, if the seller is not a U.S. citizen and the buyer is buying their home, this all comes down to the IRS wanting their money. And if the seller is a U.S. citizen and they make a profit on the sale of this home, there's no way for the IRS to get their money because they don't file taxes, right? So the IRS wants to get their share of the proceeds. And this is how it's done. They're required the buyer to withhold 15% of the money and send it to the IRS. Now, normally the title company will take care of this, and there is a form that the title company requests the sellers to sign to state, yes, I'm a U.S. citizen. And if they do, then they're all well and good. But sometimes that form doesn't actually get signed until closing, which can be a pretty big problem. Because if the form is signed at closing and you don't find out until the day of closing that the seller is a foreign person, then the buyer's got to withhold 15% of the amount of proceeds. And all of a sudden the seller is getting 15% less money than they thought they were going to get because they have to pay the United States of America. So this is definitely something to make sure is dealt with. It might be a question that you need to ask from time to time. Like I said, it doesn't come up all the time, but you just need to be aware that if you're dealing with somebody that you're just not quite sure if they're a U.S. citizen or not, talk to the title company and have them check early in the process. Ooh, Malika had this situation not long ago. Tell us about it, Malika.
They actually, it was closing day, and this investor has done a lot of purchases, and they've never had to do this before, but this particular title company required it. So they actually had to switch title companies in order to get the deal done and not withhold the FERPTA.
Really?
tax. Yes.
I don't even know how to respond to that because
it's a very unique situation. I don't think it comes up often.
No, it doesn't. It doesn't. But I did not know that, and I'm not going to speak to the legality of what happened there, but the title company that I typically work with, they check on this FERPTA situation early in the transaction, like the same time that they get authorization for payoff and all that stuff. They check to make sure the seller is a U.S. citizen, or otherwise, you've got these issues as far as withholding money. So it just seems really crazy that the buyer is required to do this, that this is on the buyer to take care of this. And I guess it's because that, as a U.S. citizen, they have a way to track you. But if you're not a U.S. citizen, they don't have any way to get your money unless they require a U.S. citizen to do it if they're going to buy your house. So just be aware that FERPTA is something that exists. You might run across it from time to time. Hopefully, if you do, it can be resolved. Okay. Buyer and seller are advised to determine whether seller is a foreign person as defined by FERPTA as soon as possible. Yeah, that's what we just talked about, which can be kind of awkward, because you don't want to be like, by the way, are you a U.S. citizen? It's like, it's really none of my business. But in this case, it is your business. That's why I always just call the title company and say, hey, I'm just not sure if these people are U.S. citizens or not. So could you check? And I just let them do their title company thing. Kind of as a neutral third party. Okay, 649, we're doing good. Okay, section 14.1, notice to the parties, professional advice and assistance. So the parties acknowledge and agree the purchase of real property encompasses many professional disciplines, while the broker, or that could also stand for agent, the broker and agent, possess considerable general knowledge. They're not an expert on matters of law, tax, finance, survey, structural conditions, hazardous, and there's a big long list there. So the broker and the agent hereby advise the parties, and all the parties acknowledge they should seek professional expert assistance and advice in these and other areas when they feel like they need them. And so basically, I kind of sum it up for people like this. I say, I'm a general practitioner of real estate. I'm kind of like your family doctor of real estate. But if you need an x-ray, I'm not going to be doing that for you. If you need brain surgery, you need to call a neurologist. But if you need any kind of special help, you need to seek that for yourself. I might recommend somebody, but I don't guarantee that this person is the best on the planet Earth. just somebody I've had good luck with before. But I'm a general practitioner. If you need a brain surgeon, you should call one. If you need a structural certification, you should call a professional engineer. If you need to talk about your financing, talk to your lender about that. If we have a legal matter, you're calling a lawyer, because I cannot handle all those different things. So just always be sure to go over that with your client and say, listen, I'm a generalist. There might come a time when you need some more help. And if that's the case, it's your responsibility to seek out that additional help. Okay, fair housing law is in here again. Of course, you go over that when you do the consumer guide with people. Here it is again. It's also on the bottom of the agency disclosure. So fair housing is all over the place. So we cannot discriminate for any of these reasons that are noted out in here. And then we have the residential property disclosure form. And this basically says that sellers are required to provide the buyer with a completed property disclosure form complying with the requirements of Ohio law. Now, this is even if the seller is a for sale by owner. Now, there are certain exemptions for the residential property disclosure form, and you can actually find a form called the exemption form, or see, it's called residential property exemption form, I think, disclosure exemption, something like that. If you look up the word exempt you'll be able to find it in the Columbus Interactive forms. And there are certain reasons that a seller might be exempt. Maybe they're a trustee of an estate. Maybe someone's lived in the house for a year as a tenant or something like that. There's like 5 or 6 different reasons. But other than any of the things in those reasons, the seller is required by law to provide the residential property disclosure form. And, as far as your involvement with the residential property disclosure form, you don't really want to handle that for them. You can't. Don't touch it. Don't even fill out the address on the top. Now, granted, it might autofill on dot loop, and if it does, then that is what it is. But other than that, do not fill out the residential property disclosure form. I don't even care if your seller is somebody who cannot write, and they need you to actually physically write for them because they're disabled or whatever. Do not fill out the residential property disclosure form. Get someone like their family member or a friend or a neighbor to help them fill out this form, because you as an agent do not want to take liability for anything that is written on that form. So don't touch it. Just keep your hands off of it. But you do need to encourage your sellers to be completely honest and truthful. And, there's no reason not to disclose things. Sometimes sellers want to try to hide stuff, but I'll tell you, it's just not worth it. And you can tell them it's not worth it to try and hide something and then have to worry for the next however many years that someone's going to come back and sue you because you didn't tell them about this problem in the house. Don't you want to move on from this property and be able to sleep at night? So disclose it. When in doubt, disclose. Even if you're not sure it should be disclosed, disclose it. I'm dealing with a situation right now where my seller failed to disclose something. And the reason they didn't disclose it is because they didn't think it was a big deal, because it was his old house. They moved in. They had this problem the whole time. They had 7 years they lived there. They basically, what happened was anytime they ran the washing machine, water bubbled up into the sink in the bathroom. And it only bubbled up a few inches, 3-4 inches, and then it would just slowly go back down. So it was like that from the first day they moved in, and they just got used to it. They didn't think anything about it. I, of course, didn't know about it because I was never over there doing laundry, but they did not put that on the disclosure form. Well, don't you know, the very first time that the new buyers ran the washing machine, the sink filled up 3-4 inches and it kept going. And it filled up and it overflowed the entire sink. It flooded the bathroom. Water came bubbling up from out behind the washing machine. So the standpipe overflowed. And the buyers called the sellers in a panic. And the sellers are like, oh, yeah, we had some problems with it bubbling up in the sink, but it never overflowed. Well, guess what? My sellers are now probably going to have to fork out a couple $1,000s for plumbing repairs because they failed to disclose that there was an issue with the washing machine line. Whether or not the buyers would have had it inspected more thoroughly or whatever, but they didn't have the knowledge that the water bubbled up. And so, it's very unfortunate that it happened. My sellers took wonderful care of the house, and they're just super awesome, great people, but they just forgot. And they just made a mistake. And it's just something they had lived with and never thought anything about it because it had never overflowed. But of course, as luck would have it, the first time the new buyer used the washer, it overflowed. And what's the explanation for that? I don't know. Maybe the sellers always used the delicate cycle and the buyers used the heavy duty cycle, and there was just more water being pushed through that plumbing line more quickly, and it just couldn't handle it. Whatever the reasoning, I have no idea. We don't know yet. The plumbers are still investigating, still repairing, still scoping the lines. We don't have a final resolution to the situation yet, but it's probably going to cost the sellers a couple $1,000 at least. So yeah, stuff can happen. Tell them to disclose it. Okay, we're going to get this done. Sex offender laws. Obviously, if a sex offender resides in the area, they're supposed to register with the sheriff, and then the buyer is basically on the hook for doing their research. So even if the seller would disclose that there was a sex offender living in the area, it could have changed the day before. So the buyer is assuming the responsibility to obtain the accurate information in regards to anything that they are personally concerned about. They are giving permission for the brokers to put financing and sales concessions in the MLS. And then here we have the closing section. We are going to get done with this. The contract shall be performed and transaction closed on or before. You put a date in there. Just check with the lender. Make sure that you're not going to crunch them up too much. If it's going to take the lender 45 days, don't put 30 days in there, because you're going to mess up everybody's expectations from the outset. So I always check with the lender, hey, how quickly can you close Joe and Sally Smith? And then I go with whatever he says, and maybe add a few days just in case. Of course, you can always extend the closing if you need to in writing, if everybody's in agreement. 15.2, final verification. Do not skip this. If you are representing the buyer, make sure you do this final walkthrough with them. The only 2 times I've ever skipped a final walkthrough for various whatever reasons, it was a problem. There were problems in the house. Both times I skipped the final walkthrough. So don't ever skip it. Do whatever you need to do to get your buyers in there to make a final verification of condition. And also it'll just give you peace of mind, because you don't want to be after the closing waiting. Are they going to call? Is there a flood in the basement? Is there, if they can't go yourself and do a FaceTime. Yes, Mark.
Gina, there's a form in dot loops that if the seller refuses or doesn't want to do the final walkthrough, that you have them sign. Mm-hmm. And even if my buyer doesn't do the walkthrough, I do the walkthrough.
Yeah, that's what I was just going to say. You can walk through with FaceTime or video or whatever. I did not know about that form, so thank you, Mark. I'll have to look that up. That's important. Yeah, I've had, like I told you guys, one was a water line break with $40,000 worth of damage to the kitchen. The other one, literally a tree fell over and sliced the house in half a few days before closing. Just sliced it down to the floor joists. It was down in the Hocking Hills, big old tree, big storm, sliced the house. It was incredible pictures. So don't fail to, and no one was living there. Now we did know about it because the neighborhood HOA called the owner and all that, but so it wasn't something that the buyer found themselves. But the one with the water, the frozen water pipes, was something the buyer found themselves. They walked in the morning of closing. There were icicles hanging 4 foot down from the upstairs ceiling down to the countertops in the kitchen. The whole place was just like frozen, like the movie. It was insane. So, okay, possession. Seller is entitled to possession through blank. At the time seller delivers possession, the premises will be in the same condition as the date of acceptance of the contract. Normal wear and tear accepted. and except as provided in paragraph 11. What's paragraph 11?
Put a time on that. I had a closing that was like, let's say like
damage
January 3rd. They gave me the keys at 11:59.
Yeah. Put a time on it. Yep. I usually say 5 p.m. or 6 p.m. or something that's going to be convenient. If you don't put a time on it, you're assuming it is midnight. You need to assume it's midnight if you don't put a time on it. So, and always make it as specific as you can, but give it the ability to flux with the close date. So instead of putting like you're going to close on July 1st and possession is July 8th, well, then if you have to extend the closing, don't forget to extend the possession. If you don't, then the seller's not going to have as much time to get out of the house. Make sure that they fluctuate with the closing date. Or I always put like seller's entitled to possession through the 7th day after closing at 5 p.m. Something that will move with the close date if you do extend the contract. Or if it closes early. Okay. And then basically when they deliver possession, it has to be in the same condition except as provided in the damage or destruction section. The seller is to remove all debris and personal property not included by the contract by the date and time of the buyer's possession. Another reason to do a final walkthrough because you don't want them to leave your crap. And then how long are you going to leave the offer open? Many times in the MLS, it'll say, please leave offers open through such a date and time. If there's nothing on there, you can strategize a little bit. You know, do we want to put pressure on the seller to try to accept us? Are we strong enough that we feel like they want to accept our offer and forget about anything else that might come along in a few days? Or you can just play nice and put a 48-hour duration of offer. It can be a strategy, but sometimes that strategy backfires, especially in a seller's market. Sellers don't like buyers putting pressure on them. So, okay, last page, and then I'm going to shut up and see if you have any questions before we close out. So make sure you fill this out as completely as you can. Obviously, the signatures buyer seller, it's best to print their name in here. This section at the bottom, brokerage license, all that kind of stuff for both the listing agent and the buyer's agent. Please fill that out as much as you can, which should be almost completely. So all the information that you need, if you're a buyer's agent, all the information that you need to fill this out is in the MLS. So fill it out. It's important information. It helps the title company. If this is not filled out, the title company was going to have to go digging up information on the agent, and they should never have to do that. And this also helps whenever the person is, thank you, Mark. This also helps whenever you're closing out the deal. You can look up you have all the information that you need to close the deal in the MLS. So don't be lazy. It just irritates me to no end when I get an offer on one of my listings and my side is blank. Okay, so in other words, also, if you try to fill this out in dot loop after someone's already signed it, you can wipe out their signatures. So if you're the buyer's agent, fill this thing out completely, both sides as much as you can. And then the seller acknowledges to receive the offer. So this section down here is not used all the time. There are situations where maybe it would be a multiple offer situation and some of the buyer's agents want to know for sure that the seller reviewed all the offers. And so you can have the seller sign all this. And by signing this, they're just saying they received it and they reviewed it. They're not agreeing to the terms. All right, we made it to the end. Woohoo! Finally. Okay, anybody got anything? Nothing in the chat. Okay, questions, comments, criticisms, hit me. Nobody? Okay. Well, we still have 6 participants. We had up to 10 at one point in time. So we have 6 people, which I think is everybody that I can see. Kristen, Alma, Nara, and Christian, and Mark and I. So thank you guys for hanging in there with us for this contract training. There are 5 installments. All 5 are going to be up on the YouTube channel. if you haven't listened to all of them or had another in-depth training or a conversation with Mark about the Columbus Board of Realtors contract, I recommend that you listen to it. I don't have all the answers, but I have used this contract an awful lot and seen a lot of things happen. So, if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer for you. Mark is available. All the leaders of AMP are available to you guys. You got our contact information a few days ago. So we're all here to help you succeed in your real estate business. Everybody good? Okay, I'm going to close this out. Been wonderful to be with you guys. I feel like I got to know some of you over these 5 hours of time we've spent together. So some of you made it to all of them, and that's pretty impressive. So we've got something in the chat. Kristen says, thank you. Thank you for coming, Kristen. If you ever need any help, let me know. All right, I'm going to turn this thing off, and you guys have a wonderful evening. Thank you, Christian.
Gina.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.